Thanks, Annie. It's a pleasure to join everybody today. Sorry that we couldn't do it in person, but I'm glad everyone's safe. Today I'm calling in from lovely Anacortes, Washington. Just a little background about myself and why I founded StrikeGraph and why we're interested in this topic. Um, I'm a lifelong software developer. I started programming as a little kid that wound up being a chief technology officer for a number of tech startups and really struggled with security and compliance in supporting our sales team. And I got very interested in the problem space, and that led to the founding of StrikeGraph. So today we're going to talk a little bit about one portion of course, the software or product ecosystem and technology, and that's DevSecOps or DevOps plus security, and how it can help drive the compliance practice that your organization might more broadly be going after. So let's talk a little bit about developer operations and security initially. One of the common misconceptions about compliance practices in general is because they impact technology, and this happens in a lot of ways. Essentially, the technology experts are asked to own the entire problem. And that's a real failure. Almost all of the common compliance standards that you might be going after, such as the SOC 2 or an ISO 27001, they span the whole business. And when we think about developer operations and security or DevOps, DevSecOps, we're really thinking about three critical areas of technology security. And primarily that's data management, logging and monitoring, and change management. These are the parts where certainly software developers, but also the folks in DevOps are dealing with systems administration issue, encryption of data, appropriate SSL certificates, access control lists, logging and monitoring of systems to make sure that they're operating well. And as a matter of fact, the core focus is really around the data. That's where the risk lies most often. And so that's also where DevOps is asked to help provide important solutions. And I think when you're thinking about data, if you're in DevOps, there are three critical aspects of data to consider. There is the availability of the data. That comes into the logging and monitoring. Do I have access to the data? There is the integrity of the data. So has the data not been malformed, or is it kept in a context that makes it valuable? And then there's finally the confidentiality of the data. So the data is only given to those folks that are provided responsibility for it. There are a lot of other parts of common standards that really have no impact on technology. And a good example of those is a fair bit of these standards deal with talent management or things like breach disclosure. So when we pull back and we think about, for example, this is SOC 2, really only about a third of the security requirements of a SOC 2 audit impact developer operations or systems administration. This is an example that we pull from our system where we look at the types of requirements a security standard like SOC 2 will place on your developer operations. And it is things like deploying system changes or security incident response execution, tracking system changes. This is not an all-inclusive list, but I think the really important thing to note is that between 50 and 65% of any security standard that you might be trying to meet, that has to deal with the larger business operation and not technology. Good. One question that we get asked a fair bit is why the new focus on these compliance standards? And we see both security professionals and people involved in DevOps and security working against compliance and trying to understand what's happening. And really what's happening is that it's happening kind of outside of the CTO's office. This is all about sales. And so this is an analysis of why organizations might adopt SOC 2. And essentially 90% of them are doing it to grow the business, either increase revenue or effectively compete against other organizations that are also doing this type of security maturity work. We think about this acquisition as kind of like a marketing asset. As a matter of fact, we call it a trust asset. So the real focus on compliance against specific types of standards has a lot to do with what buyers are asking for. And if you're getting engaged in the discussion around what types of compliance to go after, since it's such a business-centric conversation, hopefully I'm going to empower you a little bit to talk intelligently about what might be valuable for your business. So we break down these types of standards and compliance issues along two lines. Some standards deal with revenue opportunity. They're a way to prove that you have a secure and mature organization, and some standards are more liability. And certainly some standards cross both realms. That happens all the time. It's not an exclusive list, but it is good to focus on those particular issues. For instance, the California Consumer Privacy Act, if you're dealing with, I have to make sure that data encryption is happening appropriately inside my organization, that's a liability standard. If you're not following it well, you could get sued. Whereas your SOC 2 audit or your ISO 27001 certification is something the sales team that you might be working with are going to share. And so it is important when you're thinking about meeting these types of standards, it's really critical to understand what problem you're solving. And so I think if you're being loaded with this in the DevOps realm or as a chief technology officer, coming back to the organization and focusing on what buyers are asking in your sales and marketing team is going to help you line up the right type of compliance to go after first. Excellent. So let's talk about the methodology. How do we go about the process of getting to one of these compliance standards so the sales team has their trust assets and can work forward? At StrikeCraft, we've learned that this is a really simple playbook. It actually works a lot like developing a feature in a product or implementing a new architecture. The first thing that you need to do is scope and monitor the controls an organization adopts. Now, controls is a technical term, and we think of it like a user story. It's a small statement about a security practice that your organization is going to adopt. And scoping it by control instead of things like policies or scoping by essentially the requirements itself, like a SOC 2. When you scope your controls for your organization, what you get is a much more efficient and effective organization that's centered around security. And also, little secret about audit and audit practices, if there is a part of the standard that is not applicable to your business, your auditor won't test you on it. And so in an effort to get the most efficient security practice rolling that meets the compliance, it's better to understand what your organization needs. Finally, the last step is how do you organize that for an efficient audit, which is really just aggregating what controls are we operating against which standards and how are we validating that they were operated effectively? When we drive through this process, we have a really effective perspective on doing the scoping and organizing the information. The first is to go back to basics a little bit and use a risk design security posture. So it's pretty easy to identify a set of between 20 and 40 risks, measure them on an impact to your organization and a likelihood, and then how you're going to treat that particular risk if it is high enough to require a treatment. And this is a great example of one. Without an active alert system, breaches or intrusions or interruptions are going to go unnoticed, leading to a loss of data. So this risk for most organizations with an online technology tool is high, and you're going to pick controls to mitigate that risk. And the controls that you pick are where DevSecOps really comes into play. You're going to both design controls and you're going to validate that the control is operating effectively. Some controls will be automated. Some controls will require a human being to engage them to ensure that they were operated effectively. But understanding that a control like cloud tools logging are utilized to monitor production systems is a great way to understand the scope of your security practice based upon the risks that you're confronted with. Finally, after you have a good control set down, you want to validate that the controls are operating appropriately. And this is, of course, identified in evidence, and it's the same type of evidence that you'll pull together when you're thinking about an audit. Now, evidence comes in all sorts of forms and sizes. An example of a piece of evidence is actually a policy, like an approved policy for access control lists or access to your cloud environment. Another example of a type of evidence is a screenshot of your security center operating. There's a really good way to think about the types of evidence that a control will require. It can be, for example, a configuration, like a policy is deciding how the control should be operated, and also a sample. So here's a sample of a Jira ticket that shows that we executed patch management. Here is a log message showing that it was deployed into our cloud environment. Once you're starting to pull together this data, you're actually lined up to acquire one of these trust assets really easily because the controls essentially map to the standard. So for example, if the standard is measures current usage, the usage of system components is measured to establish a baseline for capacity management, you can actually use the controls for logging production systems to prove to an auditor that you're meeting this part of the SOC 2 standard. In this way, you've both scoped a security practice that really meets your organizational risks, but also maximize the impact of that across multiple standards or identified a gap. Hey, this standard is going to ask us to essentially implement a security center tool that we don't have today. First, is that an actual risk? Second, if we do identify that we need to add it, what are the controls? And now we can start gathering evidence. Now we know that we're meeting the standard and we're ready to go into audit. And so let's look at that broader roadmap as an organization. The first thing that we recommend is essentially getting ready. Do the risk assessment, identify your control matrix, identify the evidence matrix that you want to collect. Go ahead and start that security posture operating. And also start to do the research with your sales team and figure out what your first trust asset that you want to go after will be. Next, as you're preparing to go into that first audit or certification, you want to get through some achievement, get a penetration test organized against your current system so that you can have that ready for your auditor. That's something that always takes a little bit of time to organize and scope. Select an auditor you'd like to work with, perform a readiness assessment. Is there that gap between us and SOC 2? What do we need to add, or ISO 27001? And finally, I think it's critical to find an appropriate advocate when you're in audit. Audit and audit practices is not like being a chief information security officer or a DevOps engineer. They have some ideas about technology, but they're definitely not experts in it. And having someone that understands audit practices and an advocate for you and working with your auditor can make things go very efficiently and not get you pushed into checklist things or what we call security theater, where you're adding a particular security practice, whether it's helpful or not. Finally, it's important to understand that after you pass your audit, you're going to have to renew that annually. You're going to have to go back in once a year and re-pull all that evidence and data, the control operation information, because the auditor looks back historically at your practice to ensure that your controls were meeting the operation that they needed. And so throughout the year, it's good to treat security as a habit. Keep the receipts, document your new controls, and start to identify new trust assets you want to go after. We've seen a lot of success for our customers in going after SOC 2 plus ISO 27001. If they're health tech, they might be doing SOC 2 and HIPAA at the same time. And you're just constantly acquiring these marketing assets, these maturity assets that essentially help your buyers trust the great security work you're putting into place. And I think that's the last major concept I'd like to leave us with here. I think we have a lot of folks that are deep experts in security, but security is for a long time been a cost center. When I was a security associate at British Telecom, the old adage was essentially, if you haven't had a breach, you probably spent enough money. And if you did have a breach, you haven't spent enough. And what we're moving into with these standards and independent assurance of security practices is that places like DevSecOps, let alone the whole security practice of an organization, that contributes to a sales motion. It's no longer just a cost center where we hope nothing went wrong, and therefore we continue to maintain the trust of our customers. You can actually go out and certify yourself for maturity and trust. When you think about a revenue-centric approach to DevSec operations, the SOC 2 certificate you want to go after, the larger security practices, you can start to ask yourself, what are the costs? How much does it cost me to write, to scope these control practices, to actually have a vendor doing intrusion detection management, to perform securitization efforts around our CI/CD pipeline, to test for failure and monitoring, what are the inputs that we're putting in at the control level? Because if you can identify a cost around a control, you can start to really understand, how much it is taking out of your organizational capacity. At the same time, there's a benefit. How many of your sales team members are using your Clean SOC 2 report to go and win deals? And that's a direct line to revenue. And so you can help your organization start to ask questions. If trust can drive revenue, how much do I invest for what level of trust? Or how do I maximize my entire security practice for the maximum revenue coming in the other side? So I'm certainly really excited that good security practices now are considered as a part of the total value of a company, a product, a solution in acquiring new customers and growing. So I'll just pause here for questions. I actually blew through, I think, right on time with the major topics that I wanted to cover. Um, uh, uh, Katie is joining us today in this conversation. Katie, have we had any questions come through? Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I'm going to back up a little bit here to give us an image to talk about this. So, um, I've managed DevOps teams for quite some time, and it is a critical part of effective technology delivery. I think, I've seen this migrations of the traditional systems administrator into a DevOps engineer that's essentially writing code to deploy the systems. And I think when a team is very small, you can't have a dedicated DevSecOps role. You're going to need to essentially empower your DevOps engineers to understand the controls and contribute to the controls that you want to operate. And so I would say, for engineering teams on the smaller side, let's say in the sub 30, you probably are not going to add a DevSecOps engineer that's specifically thinking about DevOps plus security. But post that 30 engineers, it may be critical to at least identify an owner, and inevitably, as you get bigger, someone that can be primarily focused on security operations in the broader DevOps contribution. So I think depending on the size of the organization, you're going to see someone with a specific skill set around it. And as they are smaller, you'll just need to identify the appropriate controls. Also, Katie, you asked a question about what skill set they might come with. I quite like the ISACA certification process. On staff, we have a number of CISAs, and it's been really helpful in tying together both deep DevOps capabilities plus an understanding of the analysis of a security posture. And so I do think that if someone utilizes that ISACA track that's coming from a systems administration or a DevOps background, they can quickly get smart about security operations. Yeah, so OWASP is not a standard per se. I'll caveat that by illuminating that you can pretty much ask for an independent assessment against any document you want to write. However, there are certain standards that are more accepted than the others, like SOC 2. OWASP we think about as a recommendation for server hardening. The method of testing an OWASP implementation is a penetration test. So in some ways it is a standard, but understand that the pen tester, when they're coming in to test your deployment systems, they're looking at a broader set of vulnerabilities that OWASP help covers. Our recommendation is to treat OWASP like a control. So you will likely have in your security posture a control that DevOps supports, which is ensuring that new deployments are hardened to OWASP standard.